when you start to look at like how we're using that money and evaluating the player versus paying the player, how much are you trying to help as you try to install, a staff and work with a general manager and trying to, Jim Nagy brought in, you mentioned some of the names, highly qualified people with experience. How much are you trying to not coach them, but help them with, because you were a trader for 15 years in Chicago.
Yeah, that's right too.
You came to Philadelphia and Howie is this trade, and we're trading on draft day, and we're going to trade for this play, and unconventional means. But behind all of that, and Howie would readily admit, you were helping with how do we structure these deals, and where does the money go, and how do we allocate it, and can we turn this into a bonus, and all of that. So how important is it, the managing of the salary cap, if you will, and paying the player, while also making sure you're evaluating the right, not just a talented player, but the right player for that system?
Sure. I think evaluation and valuation is where you're getting to. Like that's yes. Sort of the
we got there.
The trade-off here we're looking at. I think they're very closely related. I think that one of the biggest issues that schools have had in negotiations, there's an emotional attachment to players, right? And if you don't have a great model, or you don't have sort of boundaries set up in advance, it's almost impossible to walk away or figure out when you've hit that point, and it's just not worth it anymore. Because, if you're dealing from, everyone has a limited resources to an extent, and those resources might be significantly different from school to school. But from those resources, you need to figure out how to build a team. And that exercise comes first. And I think when I jumped into this, maybe there was some assumption that like, hey, nerd, figure out how much we're supposed to pay these players, and I was going to like set up with like a pencil, I'm going to go pencil behind my ear and like,
right.
Crank away and hand over like this little machine that would just tell them all this. Well, team building is not like that. It's a dynamic process. You have to kind of adjust and constantly figure out, you got to know what you're leaning on and what kind of options you have, how important a player is, what the role is, like what do specific roles pay, how are we going to rotate at our defensive line? Do we want 2 studs? Do we need 5 guys? Like those are the decisions and the discussions you have way before you sit there and actually start signing players, hopefully. But to that point, no one has ever done this before in college, or hadn't. And so a lot of this, just the season bleeds or bled right into the portal. So you never have that moment when your coaches are doing everything, right? And you imagine the portal prior to this year was basically an extension of the regular season, right? Beginning in December, they just went right into portal. So basic things that happen in the NFL, you should sit down with your coaches, whether you're sitting down in person or whatever, and get a very clear evaluation of your entire team, right? From every support staff, the coaches, because you need to make a decision on not only whether they come back. In the NFL, you have multi-year contracts, and some of them you may be obligated to come back. Some of them you may be thinking about trading. But that informs you going forward. What are your needs? What do we see down the horizon, down the pipe here? But these schools, not because they wouldn't do it, they just have never done it before, and they don't have the time to sit there in advance. Having a distinct scouting staff allows, during this season, this process to go on in parallel to not having to worry about game planning and winning every week, right? Because in the past, your coaches had to make a decision to some degree. Am I spending time on next season, or am I spending time on this season? And you know how coaches, it's always about this week. They are going to sit there, burn the midnight. It could be 0-11. And for the 12th game, they're putting in the same time. They work their asses off.
Right.
But it may be taking away from the next season. But, how could you blame them? But at least when you set up a distinct kind of parallel process, this is all going at the same time. You're not compromising this season while thinking about next season. But I think that, to me, at least the player valuation side, like the money side, I think about it like a big funnel, right? It's widest at the top. You have every possible player in the country, high school, portal, any one of those might be on your roster for next year. How do you get from that huge group to the very bottom, which would be, these are the players we want to have on our roster, and these are the players we need to pay, right? And so before this nerd would sit down and say, hey, this is how we have to pay, I would say, are you sure that these players that are at the bottom of this funnel are the right players?
Right.
And I don't know that anyone could answer that with conviction. And so let's make sure that the 98% of this, in terms of your funnel and how you're getting to these players, those are the right players. Let's go through and figure all that out. And then let's also talk to the coaches. How do you want to win? Is this an offensive operation, defensive operation? Are you going to build along the lines? Or on defensively? Are you going to take pass rushers or cover corners? Are you going to pay off ball linebackers? These are things you talk about when it's quiet. You don't all of a sudden have the discussion for the first time while there's two players in front of you and you're picking between them, because I just don't think that leads to good decisions. And so for me with schools, I want partners. I want to be able to help them win. I don't think it does a whole lot of good for me to work with a school who doesn't really want to work with me or isn't really committed to actually making a change. Because the only way for me, I want to feel good about what I do. And I think this is fun when you're helping them figure out how to get better and how to win games. No one that works in sports doesn't want to win. That's right. We're all here for a specific reason because we're competitive. But I think that, that's the process. It is a process. It's not all of a sudden you just snap your fingers. And so Florida with Florida, they are it's going to take a while for them to understand, Coach Summerall and Dave, it's not just going to be old married couple from day one, right? It's new for both of them. But I think that Dave has thought about this for a long time as a good jumping off point and a good way to pivot. And he understands his primary job is to support the head coach. He's not trying to steal glory, thunder. He is trying to win. He is so competitive and he will do whatever it takes. I know he will, right? And so he will learn, what does coach want to do? What doesn't coach want to do? How can I help him? There's no question in my mind. You have so much untapped, cheap, and sometimes free labor at a school. You have all these students who want to work, which is great. Bring them in. But if they're not trained, right, these students now have the opportunity to learn player evaluation from a former NFL GM.
Mm-hmm.
This entire operation will be lifted because of that structure and how that all comes to be. There's so much to be gained by that. I think really highly of Dave as a person and a professional. And I think his background being a GM for that long, he did something right? The Jaguars were within a quarter of playing us in the Super Bowl, right? Yeah. Which now in hindsight, that's a pretty good accomplishment with what's gone on there otherwise. And I think Dave would say there's things he did, decisions he made as a GM he'd like to have back. But to have that with 5 years, I think 5 years, working in Philly to some degree with me and Howie, and now bring that to a college program, it's a huge benefit from an experience standpoint. And so I'm excited to see what comes from it.
Yeah, I think we all are. When you look at the NFL, right, I don't think it takes a personnel genius to figure out that in structuring a team, the draft has to be the foundation of your organization, and free agency, trades, but free agency as well is a kind of a supplement and going out and picking. And even like in Philadelphia, you guys were as aggressive as any organization out there and going and handpicking and work and moving and shaking to make certain deals for certain players. But the foundation was always Howie moving around in the draft, getting additional picks, a recognition, which I'm still stunned to this day when I watch organizations that don't realize, hey, it's probably better if I get more of these opportunities because you are going to fail with draft picks than packaging a bunch of picks always and moving up and winding up with 3-4 picks in the draft. I'm also stunned to this day where organizations value and try to build a foundation with free agency. And so here we are now, even I think many teams have figured it out in the NFL, but not all. But here we are now in college football where it's so new. It feels like to me that the portal is free agency, if we're making the correlation between
Sure.
college and the NFL, and recruiting is the foundation. It's the draft. A, do you agree with that assessment? And B, what's kind of the process that you're working with when you're working with a program to hire a general manager and you're trying to kind of give some wisdom to those people on how to manage the portal versus high school recruiting?
No, I agree with you in broad strokes that those are kind of the parallels. They're not perfect because, like I said earlier, I think that recruiting underlies all of this. And, in the NFL draft, you pick a player and he basically has to come to your team. There's no situation that these schools are in where they can literally pick a player, right? There is always a recruiting factor. Portal's closest, but even in the portal, what has been the case, and maybe it changes this year because it's a lot more condensed, um, players by and large insist on taking multiple visits. And so in free agency, you have certain needs in NFL free agency. You have a 2-day tampering window. Let's say you need a starter at guard or something. You may have, 3 or 4 guys. You work your way top to bottom, but you're going to come to terms with somebody in that tampering period. And that person's going to come in, take a physical, assuming that goes well, they're going to sign. In college, in the portal, you may need a guard. You may talk to 4 or 5 guards. You may have one that you really like. You make an offer, and he says, okay, I'm going to take 4 visits. And so you're sitting there, you haven't filled your need for a guard. You have this money earmarked, and now you're just going to sit there and, hold your ass for a week and a half, like waiting for these visits to take place. And oh, by the way, hey, he really likes it, but this other school just offered, 25% more, 50% more. And that's very difficult. It's hard to fill a need. It's hard to feel good about. It's hard to understand how to manage your money. And so I think that is a difficult process. I think, another thing that really comes to mind about the portal is it's a very condensed process to bring these guys up to speed, to integrate them into a team. You build culture through a coach, and that's a year-long process. But when you bring someone in the portal, you need them to contribute almost immediately, right? And so how do you get guys to contribute immediately? You need to spend time with them and develop them. And so the better the model where the coaches are more focused on coaching and developing, the easier it is to bring these guys along and make sure that your portal players have the greatest chance of succeeding in the short term. But it's difficult. I'm not simplifying. And I think getting yourself into a better structure gives you a better chance. It doesn't ensure anything. You still need to do the work. There is I believe that you make your own luck to a degree. The better your process, the better your structure, the better your luck will be by and large. But if you get a bunch of injuries at certain positions, or it finds you where you're already coming into a season weakest, or the ball bounces a little funny, we know like your season could go a way that may not be consistent with the level of talent on your team. But I do think this is about making the most good bets that you can with odds on your side. And over time, that brings sustainable success. And I think in the NFL, it's not hard to look at, there's kind of tiers of teams where these teams always seem to have a chance. Do we think that it's a salary capped, much more resource constrained than college? Do we think that that's just because they have great luck every single freaking year? No. Like, we know draft results kind of mean revert. You have great draft, you have poor draft. You have great draft, you have poor draft. But these clubs have built an organization that's sustainable. They're really, really good. And so they are ahead in most areas going into a season. And that gives them, that makes them more likely to win consistently.